Thank you so much for the invitation to join you today, and I'm so sorry that I can't be there with you in person. So in the talk today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the ecosystem of commercial academic fraud, and its connection to paper mills and other parts of academic fraud across the ecosystem. I wanted to talk a little bit about the provenance of this work, given that I study academic fraud and misconduct. Several years ago, colleague Jamie Carmichael and I began to explore and question why there was a lack of scientific or scholarly research on the topic of fake degrees and fraudulent credentials. There were a few articles and there were some reports from organizations dealing with accreditation and registrarial type organizations. But in terms of scholars digging into this world, there was very little. So we started with an edited book and asked scholars with expertise in related areas of fraud and corruption to join us. We included higher education professionals, such as those who work in admissions, registrars, as well as academic researchers, individuals who had worked in the global industry around English language proficiency testing and investigating the fraud around that. And we also collaborated with an individual who became a mentor and a friend, but whose career was in law enforcement. And his name was Alan Ezell. And Alan is a retired FBI special agent who spent the better part of his career prosecuting and investigating diploma mills and fake degree operations in the United States and their connection to international fraud. So this is the provenance of this work. In the next slide, I'll synthesize some of the findings from the entire book, and these are the contributions of all of the authors from the edited volume. What we were able to do at the end of that work was to look back on all of the chapters that had been contributed and be able to connect the dots. I think one consistent thing that you'll find through all of the presentations today is a theme of connecting the dots, but also identifying areas where we haven't yet connected the dots and we need to do some more work. So let me unpack this infographic for you. This ecosystem of commercial academic fraud, as we call it, starts with admission fraud. In other words, the fake documents or fraudulent documents or tampered transcripts that individuals might use to gain admission into an accredited and recognized post-secondary institution. There were two ways that this happens. One would be intentional deceit on the part of the applicant, where they themselves seek out and then submit fraudulent or fake documents. Another way that this happens is through working with unscrupulous or illicit educational agents who may, unbeknownst to the applicant, tamper with documents on their behalf or seek out fake documents for them and submit them on their behalf without the applicant knowing. But this is also related, of course, to standardized admissions testing and test impersonation, with the companies behind some of this providing services around things like the provision of unauthorized documents, we might say, the provision of individuals to write standardized achievement tests or English language proficiency tests. And there are individuals whose entire career, if you will, is to serve as test and examination impersonators. This then leads into the top of this infographic around contract cheating, the provision of essay mills, term paper mills, thesis completion services, including the provision of potentially fake or fraudulent research data, which can then be used in the completion of a thesis or in the case of PhDs by publication, the research articles that lead to the PhD. We were able to identify as well that some of the same companies also provide the documentation around degree mills. And with here, degree mills being a couple of different possibilities. One would be fake documents from fake institutions. In other words, the institutions don't exist anywhere but on the internet. And the other would be fraudulent documents from real or legitimate universities. For example, you go online and you buy your Bachelor of Science from Oxford University, Harvard, wherever you like. So for us, the distinction between fake and fraudulent was important here. And through this, we were able to understand that some businesses offer boutique types of products or services. For example, an international student recruitment agency may only offer admissions documents, but there are full service operations, if you will, that offer what we might call in North America the Happy Meal of fraudulent documents and services that could include paper mills. The connection to paper mills was a little more tenuous, but it seems to reason to us that the connection between a company that might sell contract cheating services, especially term papers and theses, would make sense that they would also then extend the business model to include scientific paper mills around that. So what we're looking at here, we were able to connect the dots with the available evidence, noting that there are still significant gaps. Based on the available evidence, we came up with an estimate of this industry being worth at least, and we believe this is conservative, about $21 billion US. That's be like Bravo billion. And we believe that there's still much more work to be done. But the key message from all of this, as I'm in my final few seconds, is what we learned from our FBI special agent colleague is to follow the money. In order to understand the industry, we have to understand how it operates and what the various sources of revenue are. And with that, my time is up.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Deborah, and to all of you for being here today. So I'm going to talk very quickly about the research integrity concerns that we're dealing with at Taylor & Francis. And I think what I will go through today will be an experience shared by many others in the publishing industry. So this slide here represents the different shapes and sizes of research integrity concerns that we deal with. The way I've arranged it here is around what could be the result of unintentional misconduct or error. And as you go further along into the red, this is where the only explanation is that it's intentional misconduct. So back in the day, I started in publishing in 2008, always working on journals, and there's always been research integrity and publishing ethics concerns. But a lot of what we were dealing with back then was sort of back in what you see in the green tiles here, authorship disputes, duplicate submission publication, and a lot of that was for maybe there's a misunderstanding about guidelines or policies, or it maybe a little bit could be intentional. But our approach in terms of when we resolved it was also to, in the spirit of COPE principles, to also take an educational approach to when we were interacting with the authors, primarily authors, because sometimes it was just a bit of a, they didn't know that they couldn't submit to more than one journal at the same time. But life has changed a lot since then. And we really are tipping much more over into the red tiles. So we're seeing so much more deliberate misconduct. And the only explanation is that it is deliberate, because we're seeing things like fake data, image manipulation, fictitious names. It's a bit a bit of a murky world when you go into it. At Taylor & Francis in particular, we've had a huge spike in ethics cases. So when I say ethics case, it could refer to multiple articles, it could refer to multiple journals. The reason it's a case is because there's some similar patterns against it. And I took on this role in 2019, and back then we had about 175 cases. Last year we had just shy of 4,000 cases in our team. So not only are the volume increasing, the complexity has greatly increased. So where we used to think that a data or image manipulation case was complex, those are just easy for us now. That's just, been there, done that. We know what to ask for, we know what to look into. But as time has gone on, and particularly since 2020, when we became aware of paper mills, we're seeing so much more around, Sarah mentioned some of this as well, that the fakeness of the original data as well. And that really blew my mind when we first started to receive that you would give us a file claiming it's the original data, but actually it's fake. And we were just lucky that we happened to have the research backgrounds in those fields to be able to take one look at it and go, oh, this is not original data. This is not what this is meant to look like. But as we've gone on, like if we think where we ended up last year, we're seeing a lot more around the coordinated misconduct between stakeholders. And that's the bit that worries us the most, because what's been happening more and more is that there's been a layering of misconduct, because as soon as they know what signals you're going after, if it's systematic manipulation, then they know how to remove some steps from each other so that you can actually hide better. So we have to look at it more as networks now, trends, groups, and that's how we're sort of detecting things like H-index boosting. So a lot of citation manipulation going on. It may not be the direct people handling the content, but you look at their networks and you see this is how they're working in concert with each other. So this coordination is because of the rewards that are attached with publishing and being cited if you do get published. So where do we go from here? The more we look, the more we find, the more time goes on, the more the signals adapt. Anyone who's involved in systematic manipulation is doing it for a reason. And they have resources, probably more resources than we have. So what do? We can't just be in this constant churn of looking for things and retracting articles and rejecting articles. We need to do something. As editors and publishers, we're just one part of the research integrity system. And this will be of no surprise to any of you. You know, of course, there's research institutions who are part of this, funders are part of this, and other stakeholders who you can say hold the stick in some cases. So you have COPE, Clarivate, for example. I mean, they're part of this system as well. So what do we do in terms of actually working together so that we're not just talking within an echo chamber, talking just to ourselves about what we should resolve without actually looking at it more broadly? So there's been a few things that have come out of this. The one thing I will say about Paper Mills is they brought us closer together. So there's something there, you know, silver linings. So one of the things that came out recently was United to Act, which is a group that both Deborah and I co-chair. But the idea with this group is that it would be unlike other working groups which might have been just the publishers or just researchers. You know, the idea with this group is that you have representatives across the key stakeholder system to be able to share with each other what we're seeing, what skills do we have, how do we actually share skills, share knowledge to actually come up with the practical solutions. That was one of the things we said. We don't want white papers from this. We want practical solutions. We want tools. We want to learn from each other and actually see how we can actually tackle the problem with systematic manipulation. At Taylor & Francis, we've done another thing. We launched earlier on this year a research integrity lab with the Chinese Academy of Sciences Library. And that, again, is to trade on each other's skills and insights to be able to identify if there's one or two really key areas within the Chinese research ecosystem that we can actually tackle. And of course, the STM Integrity Hub, which many of you will be aware of, and kudos to the people behind the Integrity Hub, because they've really pulled people together to work on common solutions. So I'll just end by saying the only way forward is together. And it's kind of cheesy, but I like saying that because it's true. So with that, I'll hand back.
Thank you for inviting me. I guess I should just share confession. This is my first scholarly publishing conference. So thank you for being so welcoming, and thank you, Deborah, for inviting me to join this panel. So what Deborah asked me to do, she told you my background. I've spent pretty close to the last half century working in consumer finance, a lot of it around risk management and some of it in fraud management. And so Deborah made the sort of simple ask, can I condense what we've learned in 60 years to 3 slides in 6 minutes? And I sort of learned that when Deborah makes a request, you can fight it or you can ultimately just do it. And that's the easiest way to go forward. So here we go. 60 years in 6 minutes and 3 slides. Okay, what have we learned? So we learned that fraud moves really fast. It's ever changing. It's those out to beat you are really clever. They are smarter than you are. They are more resourced. They are more motivated. And they will find a way to get published, right? And it's a cat and mouse game, right? You're going to hide the cheese, and this is a mixed metaphor because it's not a cat. The mouse is going to find the cheese. You'll hide it again. They'll find it again. This is going to go on. So you will never eliminate fraud, right? But what you can do is contain it, and you can run a healthy and successful business with this contained. But in order to do that, you need data, a lot of it, And you need, and we've heard this term again, Sarah just used it, we need to connect the dots, right? It's hard to do, and there's a lot of work to be done to really make that happen in a deep and comprehensive way, but you need to do that. You need management that is focused on this issue, empowered to act, that's always watching, because when fraud moves, it moves quickly, and you can't be sitting back, because while you're sitting back and studying the problem, it's happening, and it's costly. And ultimately, if publishing proceeds the way, at least I expect, and the way financial services proceeded, this is an industry problem, and it's addressed across the industry. It'll take a while to get there, because individual publishers, in my experience, at least in financial services, initially think that they're going to go it alone, but in time, there'll be a realization that it's both. Individual publishers will have to develop expertise, and the industry will have to share experience, because if you close down fraud in your business, it's happening somewhere else. And if you're not watching that and sharing that, it'll move to you, because it'll find the vulnerability. Second thing is, second point, identifying fraud early in the funnel, in your case, it's the publication funnel, is both is as efficient and most effective. So for reasons that we don't have to go into here, for good reasons, most of the effort, at least I've observed in publishing, is happening on the right side. It's happening post-publication through retractions. It's now being worked on in peer review, and the several speakers I've heard have talked about, and I think it's true, that peer reviewers are scarce, highly valuable, right? And their expertise is around their subject matter, not detecting fraud. So it's a real misuse of a scarce resource to have them looking for fraud. We want to be doing that earlier, where the funnel is wider, there's more volume. So we want to be screening at submissions, or you do, screening at submissions. And I would argue even further to the left that we want to be screening and put filters for those who are giving grants. We want to have ways of working with institutions to have them do some of this monitoring. And so we need to keep pushing the fraud detection earlier and earlier in the pipeline. That makes for cleaner, cleaner product flowing through the pipelines. Peer reviewers can do their job, and so on. And what gets published is better. Governance matters, and this is something this is where I realized that bankers are from Mars and publishers are from Venus. So I've been talking to publishers from, well, I've not been doing this for long, but several months, and I would talk about governance, and I would get these blank stares, and I would realize that somehow I wasn't connecting. And what I came to realize, actually, Sabina, I give her credit for, in one of our prep discussions for this, just opened my eyes that, I take risk management for granted, right? Bankers and lenders have been dealing with risk management for 4,000 years. Since the Mesopotamians made the first loans of grain, in the Fertile Valley, right? We've been thinking about this. And if you look at banks, there are risk organizations throughout the bank, every bank, right? They have risk management at the corporate level. Risk management committee reports to the board directly. Every business unit has a risk management team. Every product has a risk management team. And so there are always thoughts about that. And in publishing, it's just trust, right? This is, the most welcoming, community I've been in. And it's just about, if you write it, we take your word for it. It's not going to work that way going forward, right? The gig is up. And so you need a group of senior managers who are thinking about this risk-reward trade-off. On one hand, you can stop fraud, but you're going to stop all publications to do that. Right? And so you'll have no fraud, you'll have no business. On the other hand, you can follow the path that some publishers have followed recently, is do a lot, publish a lot, and have a big problem with fraud, right? Every organization has to make that trade-off. Where do we set the dials between those two extremes? And it's going to vary by organization. It may vary by journal. It may vary by field of study. But those are the debates that have to take place at a very senior level in the organization, and make those decisions. Then track to see where the new waves are, what's working, what's not working, and make adjustments. So it takes a dedicated team looking at a lot of data to make those assessments. And the last point I want to make, and it's to the connecting the dots, and I'm going to say I'm the only one with a slide that actually connects the dots. Okay? Because I'm a literalist, but we do need to connect the dots, and it's to not do any kind of plagiarism. I was looking online to see if I could find a better picture of this, and I looked and I saw some beautiful ones, and I said, you know what, I'm not going to touch this for this group because I'm going to draw my own. But you think about the data you have, right? The data you have, in order to detect fraud, we have to find patterns, very deep patterns. And those patterns, if you think about this publishing industry, we have authors. Authors write with co-authors. They write an article together. Some of those co-authors write with other co-authors and write another article together. Those articles cite other articles with authors who are affiliated with institutions that come to conferences like this, that are part of the professional societies, and you think about all these connections, and I mean, I can't get my head around it, but it's a massive web of connectivity over time. So an author who's been doing this for 20 years, maybe, or whatever, has a fingerprint. That fingerprint is unique, right? Every author, every scholar, if you have enough data, you can find a unique fingerprint for that author and scholar. And those fingerprints have commonalities among them. That's the good world. Thankfully, the fraud world is really hard to it's really hard for the fraud world to replicate that fingerprint. And they have their own patterns. And so by finding the differences between what goes on in the virtuous world, comparing it to what's going on in the fraud world, and looking at all this data, you can start to identify where the problems are coming from with a much higher probability. This is really important because fraud is rare. And to find rare events, you have to really squeeze the juice out of that data. And that's why this has to be done in a term we use, multivariate way. You have to look at all of this data at the same time, right? Looking at them sequentially, right? Plagiarism, as we've seen done, plagiarism, bad graphics, so on and so forth, doesn't get all of that information because there's connectivity amongst those different elements. So to do this, you're going to need three functions. Data, we just talked about it, but it's disconnected data from a single source that's going to provide the information about where the problems are. It's going to provide the information for you helping to set the risk-reward trade-off. It's going to provide the data for you to track whether you're meeting your expectations. It's ultimately going to feed to models, which is later in the development stage. But between the data, governance, which we talked about a little bit, and ultimately taking all this data with the guidance of governance and squeezing it and putting it all together to build these multivariate models, maybe ultimately using AI in some way. This is a solvable problem. And with that, I yield the balance of my 6 minutes, which probably is 0. And by the way, the first slide and last slide don't count. So
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for those very amazing different perspectives. I could have listened to all of you for an hour, but we didn't have that each.
6 minutes.
Each, but you all only had 6 minutes. But we're now going to have a discussion, and in our pre-meeting, there were a couple of questions that this group were really quite interested in. So I'm going to pose them to the group, and I'm going to ask each of them in turn to just say a few words in answer to those questions. We've got 3 of them, and then I'm going to open the questions to the floor. So the first question was, what actually motivates someone to publish a fraudulent paper? And Sarah, could you start the discussion?
I mean, it seems to me, speaking as someone who works in higher education now, that the motivations are easy. It's either to keep your job or to get a promotion if you already have a job. So that there's an absolute motivation on the part of the people that are doing this, because again, it's sort of the idea of follow the money. And whether it's the idea of keeping a job or getting tenure or getting promotion or getting bonuses for the amount of research papers that people write, the motivation, I think, has to do with maintaining, sustaining a career and getting paid for that.
Sabina, anything to add?
Yeah, actually, that's so. I think to add to Sarah's point, which I agree with, it's also the lack of consequences. There's no real long-term consequences. So yes, we can retract the articles, but if the individuals or groups, as Sarah says, go on and get their promotions and get their funding, what it does, it sets the example for other researchers coming up from behind to go, well, this is the way that I'm going to fast track my career. So in the absence of those long-term consequences that connect up across the different stakeholders, why wouldn't you?
Alan, I know you were amused by this discussion.
It was Sabina that introduced me to the idea of trust. It's something, I've been at bankers conferences and that word has never been uttered. So it was sort of a new world for me. But what as Sarah and Sabina just articulated, I think is spot on. I would, in essence, you get what you measure. If you measure someone's basic value based on how many publications they produce and get published, well, there's a lot of motivation to publish and produce. And if publishing and producing is what gets you grant money, there's going to be a lot of incentives to go and publish and produce. And so all of those incentives currently lead, and as Sabina said, without consequence until recently, to where we are. And I think the consequences have to get pushed back, and this is where I don't know publishing very well, but it seems to me we need to push it back to institutions, right? The institutions that sponsor the scholars need to be, I hate to use the word, but punished, right? That they need to, it needs to be harder for them to get funding if their scholars are not, if the scholars are not doing scholarly work. You'd like to see the money grantors to be looking at the institutions and the authors and the scholars to be saying, you've been associated with others maybe, or even been involved with a publication that's been questionable. Well, it's going to be harder for you to get funded. And so those consequences will ultimately make their way, if they happen, will make their way through, and you'll start seeing behavior based on what gets measured. So again, it gets back to data, to measurement, and being able to connect those dots.
Which is sort of your answer to question 2, which is how do we ensure that incentives are aligned across the different stakeholders so that people are no longer rewarded for publishing fraudulent work?
Yes, so there are positive incentives. I mean, wouldn't it be great if an author who has published 25 publications and has never had a problem and has been associated with other co-authors that have never had a problem, well, gets, I would say almost like green light at 100%, but goes through the process fast, right? Has priority processing. That's the positive side. The negative side, if you haven't behaved well, you're going to sit in the back of the line. You're going to have to take your shoes off and take your computer out of your bag, and you're going to get well searched.
Sabina, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the ways to incentivize good behavior is to reward good behavior. I think the good research is not as rewarded or as recognized as lots and lots of publications. I think because there's so much that is such a big success metric. And, we hear this all the time. I mean, even back when I was a postdoc, it was the same story, and it hasn't changed. I was a postdoc many, many years ago, and it's when I meet postdocs now, they say the same thing, that there's no incentive from the institutions to actually publish all of their research, not being rewarded for actually following strong protocols and publishing that. All of that, the null and negative finding stuff that's sitting in the bottom of drawers because no one cares if it's published. So if that's not being rewarded, and actually you're being rewarded on publishing high numbers of articles and no one's checking if those articles are true or even good, then the invested interest to do good work is kind of whittled down to just a few people. And at the same time, it's sort of going back to what I said before, that it's very visible when someone is being rewarded and getting awards and grants and getting big laboratories, and that kind of thing is very, very visible. And it starts to skew the understanding of what good research looks like, because you sort of get mentored by the wrong people.
Sarah, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think there are lessons to be learned from academic integrity and student conduct, with a couple of examples being in many publicly funded universities, there are annual reports around student academic misconduct. They're de-identified, and often the data are presented at a quite a high level. I would love to see universities around the world produce similar reports for research misconduct, again, in a de-identified way, and that funders would demand such publications or reports from the universities over time. Another thing would be for universities to keep track. We do this for student conduct. Our registrar's office will keep track of student academic misconduct, say in a confidential manner, and that universities as well should have centralized ways of tracking allegations or follow-up around research misconduct. And the third thing, I think, to Alan's point, is for universities to include research misconduct in their fraud plans. There are risk management plans. Universities around the world have them, but in my experience, research misconduct is not included in those. But if you think about the cost to a university for a research misconduct investigation and the number of people around those tables involved in those investigations, from deans, associate deans, vice presidents of research, and all the lawyers, it's not inconceivable to think that a research misconduct investigation could cost a university upwards of $100,000 US. And if you multiply that by multiple allegations, then that could become a costly endeavor for universities. So to curtail that output of cash or labor, that could be one way for universities to tackle it.
Thank you.
Can I ask you a question, Sarah, as an academic? What would you think about a faculty member losing tenure?
It's probably, in my experience, depending where an academic is, it might be easier for them to lose their job than to lose tenure. With tenure giving you sort of the right to research a variety of topics, and however tenure might be defined in, say, a collective agreement. But if, for example, research misconduct finding were a dismissible offense, then I can't imagine that a union would object to that, but there could be objections to losing tenure.
Okay. And then the final question, and I think this is really for Sarah and Alan. What can research publishing learn from other groups such as FBI, financial services, to address the problem of fraud, and how can we harness new technology and big data to help us assess the content? So let's start with Sarah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I learned from this retired FBI special agent, Alan Ezell, is that there is an actual cost to society for fake degrees, fraudulent credentials, fake research papers. I mean, we only need to look to the Wakefield papers around autism and how that was debunked, but the myths continue to perpetuate. So the risk to science means the risk to society. And if we want to curtail a negative impact on society, it needs to start with scientific publishing.
Okay. Alan.
I guess I would say from financial services, what I would take away is that the people who are trying to perpetrate fraud on your industry are smarter than you. And they're more clever than you, and they'll find a way they'll find wherever the vulnerability is, they will eventually find it. And that people in this room have to work together to share information, because it's going to move from one publisher to another. It's going to, and you want to be able to see the early signs. That's one. The other is it's not going away, right? I mean, there was a chart yesterday, and I don't remember if it was exactly on this, but the survey question was, when does the industry get back to normal, right? To the state, and there was 1 year, 2 year, right? And the Never group was like that, really small. Well, it never goes back to where it was, right? In my opinion. So that's something to kind of realize. And the third point I would make is that you have to make investments. You need to build infrastructure that seems to be not yet well developed, that allows you to collect this data and connect those dots. And it's hard because the data wasn't collected in a way that was intended to ever be connected. And even the data that's available, as the company that I'm now with, we've been working for the last year to connect some of the dots, and we've had some success, but it was much, much harder than we had anticipated because the dots were never meant to be connected. And so you need to start thinking about how you actually build out that web of information. A long-winded answer.
Thank you. So I want to open up questions to the floor. And there's
All right, thank you very much. I had the pleasure of having lunch with Deborah and Sabina. My name's Tom Baird. I'm an investigator with Health and Human Services, so I'm speaking from the US perspective, but many of the topics discussed here are actually in place in this country. If you, as an institution, have an assurance with our office, which is 5,000 international institutions, you're required every year to report to us what research misconduct concerns you had. It's a confidential process. The result of that investigation can be anything from debarment, which happens frequently. That says you can no longer receive federal funds. So if you're a physician, you can't receive Medicare and Medicaid or work at a hospital. People are detenured all the time, but it's confidential, so it doesn't make the news. It happens frequently. And I guess just to summarize, I think the UK, we do have a cousin partner there, so I can't speak for what's going on in continental Europe. But there are severe consequences, and many of the fraud cases that do make the news begin with academic research misconduct, where small company funds are used to identify the initial observation. Those observations are then funneled into investor fraud. So this stuff isn't public. It's not in the Wall Street Journal. It's not in the New York Times. It happens behind closed doors. If an investigator is debarred, which happens frequently, they can't apply for any kind of US funds from any agency. It's just that our rules and regulations in this country preclude us from making that information globally available to news outlets. So a lot of the infrastructure is there. We distinguish fraud, which is a criminal crime, from research misconduct, which we handle in administrative courts and civil courts. So there's a system in the United States to handle our $48 billion enterprise.
Thank you. Liz has the microphone.
Thank you, Deborah. My question is mainly to give Alan an excuse to use the word trust in a public forum again. So, Sarah talked about the cost to institutions of investigating this. As we have gone through the last year, 18 months, 2 years or whatever of this much increased activity that Sabina's talked about, there is a significant cost to publishers of cleaning the record, putting these new defenses into place, figuring out ways to try to stay ahead of the people who are always going to be smarter than us. And I'm interested in if Alan has another lesson from the financial services industry of how much that industry invests as a rough percentage of revenue or of cost in preventing this kind of fraud as well as cleaning it up.
You know, I don't have those numbers, but over the last 60 years, I mean, the consumer finance industry has invested billions. I mean, billions and billions. You think about, so your challenge is actually not quite as complicated. You think about a credit card, and I bet almost everyone in this room has been stopped at some point or questioned about a transaction they've done. But you're trying to identify a fraudulent transaction anywhere in the world in a nanosecond, right? And that actually works. You know, it actually works. And it does that. So, billions and billions have been invested over the last 60 years. And that gets done by basically doing what we described here. Each one of us in this room has a consumer credit card fingerprint. You spend in the same places, you spend the same amount each month, roughly, right? There's certain places you never go, certain places you do go. And those patterns are unique to you. It's like your DNA. And by identifying that, and against fraudulent behavior, which is go through a whole bunch of patterns there, you can detect it. But the investment is huge, right? And so I don't want to scare anybody. And it's not all at once, but it's going to be continuous, and it's significant.
Antonio.
Question for Alan. Well, first of all, an observation. You talk about this stuff with this big smile on your face, which I've just found fascinating. You love this stuff.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. It's such a friendly group.
It's scary for us. You use the word trust, and I wonder whether actually there's some naivety in our industry, which is maybe something you'd like to address. But really my question is about, you talked about fingerprints. We have started discussions about identity and putting the onus on the researcher to verify their identity before they publish an article. So my question was around that. How much do we have to do to trace the fingerprints versus pushing it back to the researcher to say, prove you are who you say you are, in the way that when you open a bank account, you have to take your passport and accept birth certificate.
Yeah,
et
so
cetera, et cetera.
that's actually a great question. The answer is you could probably do some of that, but those at the beach, you'll find ways around a lot of that in time. This identity thing. So one of the things I know, actually, Deborah and I were talking about this last night, and one of the things to be careful about so by asking a researcher to go through lots of hurdles in order to submit a paper, you create what at least in consumer finance we call adverse selection. And every time you put a barrier in the way of a good author, in this case, a barrier for that good author to do business with you, it makes it less likely that the author is going to stay with you, and you lose a good prospect. The fraudster is always there. I mean, you really can't dynamite him out of your flow, right? I mean, you're going to try to find him, you'll try and filter him, but they're going to keep trying. And the analogy I used with Deborah yesterday is think about someone applying for a loan. Right? So a bad guy wants a loan, a high risk guy, right? They're going to you go back and ask that person for his last 3 years of tax returns, he'll give them to you. If I asked you for your last 3 years of tax returns, you might say, you know what, this is not worth it. And you're going to go away. And that business is lost, and ultimately the loss rates in that portfolio are going to go up. In this case, the fraud rates would go up.
Matthew.
Matthew Sod from Akabana Consulting. Thank you very much to all three panelists. Again, I wanted to ask Alan, it's a little bit similar to what Antonio's just asked. A project I've been working on is around, with other people, of course, is around trust markers for researchers. So verifying people's identity, who they say they are. And of course, the difficulty there is you can verify that someone is who they say they are, but you can't verify that they're trustworthy, because of that. But one thing which you said really struck a chord with something that came up earlier, actually at a meeting we had last year, was you were describing something that's a bit similar to TSA Pre, for example, where you are an accredited person and you have to do that work. And you, in your industry, in banking and fraud and risk management, what do you think in terms of sort of techniques and technology? Do you think we can learn as publishers from your industry? Are there things which are immediately applicable? You've just outlined a problem with one set of those, but I just wonder if you could just give some thoughts about that for a moment.
Well, first off, did you say you were from Mathematica?
No, I'm a consultant.
Oh, consultant. I thought you said the company. So that was my first job was at Mathematica, and that's how I ended up in this crazy business. But okay, never mind. So in terms of so the way I would envision it, I mean, at least in the publishing world, if you're able to collect this long history of author and author behavior, and that long pattern over time, I mean, you could sort of certify an author as being trustworthy. And you want to verify that the author actually submitted that scholarly work, so you're not dealing with what we would call true name fraud, right? You're a well-known author, you have a long history, you've published 30 papers over 20 years or maybe more. All have been good, no retractions, right? I'm pretty confident that if I get a real paper from you, the next one is going to be good. I have to worry about whether it is a real paper from you. So one of the things, clearly I assume you do, but you want to do more diligently, is to go and verify, did you actually submit this paper, right? Because someone can take your identity, submit a paper, and I'm told that there are papers that have authors' names on it, and the author doesn't even know they have written that paper. So you do want to probably go back and at very minimum verify that they submitted that paper. But if you are who you are, there are ways based on collecting that data and tying it together of coming to an estimate that is very likely to be a good paper. So I mean, those are things I would really focus on the author. So the authors are the actors, right? Who are the actors that do the fraud as authors? Many of the single point things you were talking about, point solutions, are looking at the symptoms of an author, right? Did I doctor a graphic or a paper mill, right? These are all symptoms. You want to go back to the root. It's the actors that are doing something, and the extent that you can focus on the actors, you have a better chance of solving this.
So Roger and then Leslie. Oh, you've got one there. But Roger's had the mic for ages. All right, okay.
Hi, Roger Schoenfeld from Ithaca. Thanks for the terrific panel. I'm sorry, but I may be the the difficult question or the hard question. So in lots of industries, the things that we want out of that industry as a kind of public good or common good aren't necessarily in the interest of individual companies to produce. And my example here is airline safety. Some people here have heard me talk about this before. Vitally important that we have the safest possible air travel, but it's in the interest of every airline and every airplane manufacturer to have great safety records, and yet they underinvest in safety, right? Systematically, they all do. And what's the solution to that? Because their incentives lead them to make those kinds of trade-offs, right? And what's the solution in the United States and many other countries? The solution is government regulation, right? And accident investigation boards and all of these kinds of things. The financial services sector is a perfect example of where all sorts of bad acting from individual companies have threatened the economy over the course of time. Many of us lived through that in 2007, and the solution. Maybe not everyone agrees with this, in different political perspectives or whatever, but lots and lots of regulation to try to control risk and manage risk. So I'd like to ask the panel, and Alan, you obviously have a particular position or a perspective on this, but I'd really like to ask the whole panel. Whether we think of the industry as universities, by the way, I think universities dramatically underinvest in this area. Publishers have, we've discovered, have underinvested too until recently. Is this a self-regulating opportunity, or maybe should we hope for some external intervention?
Let me start with Sarah.
Thank you for this question. I love this question because I think that there are certain bodies that are not part of this conversation that should be. And those are the quality assurance agencies and the accreditors. So if the accrediting bodies come forward and say, we need to see your research misconduct policies, procedures, and the number of cases that you've had and how you've dealt with them, and to see that there are things in place. And if universities don't have that, are unwilling to provide it, et cetera, that could negatively impact accreditation. No university in the world wants that. And we've seen similar things. I'll give you an example. In Canada, there's the engineering, I think it's called the Engineering Accreditation Board, that requires all university engineering programs to have a policy and procedures around academic integrity that is maintained, kept up to date, and so forth. And if they don't, then the engineering program risks losing its accreditation for their engineering programs. But I have yet to see any accrediting body extend that to research integrity. So if it gets connected to institutional quality assurance, that could change the game.
Thank you. I know there are at least 3 more questions out there. And so is it all right with you if we move on to the next one? So,
hello. Pretty insightful in terms of observations from the financial segment. I'm Gayatri, Head of Transformation with Strive. We've been building research integrity solution along the same lines, interestingly. What you had mentioned about the rules engine that drives some of these several aspects related to authors colluding with other authors and being able to just identify pattern of articles that have already been retracted and the first authors with the retracted articles colluding with other authors within the network, sort of just producing that. Interestingly, what we found out was, our method was more around the incoming articles being able to just profile them as under some sort of a risk score, and potentially could go through penalties of certain workflows, rounded workflows, and other round trips that may be required to additional reviews before get its way into the system. But what the other analogy from the financial industry could be to ascertain a fraudulent score, credit score, very similar to, if it hurts your credit score, could that be something that can be adopted within the authorship, where several bodies could come up with some sort of a research credit score to the research world in itself. That can, if the research community understands that it hurts their individual scores, then, and if that availability, it is also available across the publishers, then it would hurt their reputation in terms of submissions.
100%. 100%. That's exactly what has to happen and what will happen. Yes.
And currently, there are no metrics to validate a particular researcher in terms of their, credibility. We want good scores also to be promoted. We also want these sort of scores to be highlighted in the system.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
I mean, can I just add, I don't agree with that. I think the last thing we need is another metric, because a metric can be gamed. We've seen so many examples of that, and we're already aware, and we're talking a lot about authors and papers, but really the research integrity problems are literally across. It's the reviewers, guest editors, special issue proposals. It's at so many different stages. It's not always the author and the article. So the moment you add another score, like, how would that be different from the H-index, which we are seeing being gamed at the moment as well? So I personally don't like the idea of another metric.
That's sort of the art of how you build the score, because you want to include attributes in your score, factors in the score that can't be gamed, right? And so there are, again, a dirty secret inside of lending. So, in the old days, loan applications were taken into the branch, right? You walked into a branch, you filled out a loan application, and one of the cardinal rules we never told a branch platform manager, person who took the loan application, what was in the score, because I guarantee you, to your point, that would be gamed, right? Are you sure your income is only 50,000 and not 60,000, right? You get those questions to try and move you to wherever the cutoffs were. But there are behaviors that are not gameable, right? The examples you just went through about the authors, what actually happened is fact, right? Those are less gameable, and that is just the behavior. And there is a certain probability of trouble coming from someone who has certain patterns. And so that's what the score should pick up. So I sort of agree with you. You don't want a gameable outcome, but I'm going to disagree. And I think that's where the puck is going, and I think you're on the right track.
I'm really sorry, but it's 2:00, and this conference has managed to keep on time all the way through. So I'm not going to ask for any more questions, but I think this conversation could go on for another 2 hours if we let it. But please do, continue the conversation with at least the panelists who are here. And I think they are keen to go on having this conversation outside this meeting. So thank you so much, all three of you, for a really stimulating discussion.